Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski. I am a faculty member at Northwestern University and the director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It is really a pleasure to have you with us. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Cristina Mislán is an associate professor of journalism studies in the Missouri School of Journalism. Catalina Farías, a doctoral student at Northwestern University and affiliate of the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Cristina in just a minute. I am delighted to note that this quarter, our series is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television, and Film, the Program in Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and the Program in Latino Studies. But before we go to the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes, and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly a little bit more about how the seminar will unfold. First, Catalina will tell us more about Cristina's research and career in just a minute. Then Cristina will present her work. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar. Catalina will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us, and without further ado, Catalina, the screen is all yours.
Thank you so much, Pablo, for having me as a moderator for this week. It's truly an honor for me to introduce Professor Cristina Mislán, who in just a couple of minutes will talk about discursive solidarity, communal survival, media-making practices, where she envisions a future in which solidarity media-making practices within Black and Brown communities generate just and sustainable life. Professor Mislán is an associate professor of journalism at the Missouri School of Journalism at the University of Missouri. Her research focuses on media history, critical and cultural studies, and transnational globalization studies. Using critical and cultural studies, Professor Mislán examined how various forms of alternative media have influenced national and transnational dialogues around race, class, and gender politics. Moreover, she also has focus on media representation and its relationship to race and gender identities. Professor Mislán holds a PhD in mass communication with a minor in Latin American graduate studies from the Pennsylvania State University, a master in journalism from Louisiana State University, and a bachelor's degree in English and psychology from the same university. She has published in several journals, including the International Journal of Communication, Feminist Media Studies, Social Movement Studies, and Communication, Culture, and Critique. Her research has won awards from the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication and the American Journalism Historians Association. She is currently working on 2 books, one about Black writers after the Cuban Revolution, and the other about climate blues in southern Louisiana and Puerto Rico. We are truly honored to have Dr. Mislán share her research with us today. And as a reminder to our audience, you can submit your question in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen at any time during the seminar. We will address them at the end of the presentation. So, without further ado, please join me in welcome Professor Mislán to the screen.
Thank you, Catalina and Pablo. I'm going to share my screen right now so you can see my PowerPoint. Okay. So, hi everyone. I'd like to start by thanking the Center for Latinx Digital Media at Northwestern University for inviting me to participate in the program's virtual seminar series. Today, my intention is to draw from my previous and current work on social movements and activist media to encourage us to envision what it might mean to survive in community across Brown and Black spaces. In much of my work, I've been inspired by questions that ask how Black and Brown writers and activists have participated in print culture to shape understandings of liberation politics while also counteracting power structures. The stories that they tell and how they tell them have undergirded much of my work. I'm particularly invested in examining how marginalized communities adopt storytelling tools to help shape meaning around racial, class, and gender politics. I'm always inclined to search for those stories that come from below, that are grounded in Black and Brown people's everyday lived experiences. Just quickly, an overview for what I will talk about today. I want to give you some background, give you a sense of kind of why I'm interested in these conversations around solidarity, around activist media, talk a little bit about myself, what informs my understandings of discourse and solidarity, how do we define solidarity, and then I'll give an example, a kind of historical example that Catalina mentioned. I'm working on 2 books, which I'm not going to talk about both today, but I'll focus on the first one, which is about Cuba and Black writers. And I want to use that as a kind of historical example to then think about our kind of contemporary and future possibilities around activism, around creating community, and around creating solidarity. And transition from that example or those examples from my book into thinking about contemporary forms of how activists are thinking about solidarity, writing about solidarity, expressing solidarity. Largely, I'm really interested in the idea of the zines. So I want to talk about that as a kind of possibility for us to think about as like 21st century radical media. And then I want to end with some forward, looking kind of ideas about what it might mean for us to think about creating and sustaining and cultivating solidarity via radical media practices, and the zine being as like an example of that. So perhaps it's that I grew up Puerto Rican in the Deep South, in a small town about 25 miles outside of New Orleans, that has encouraged me to dedicate my scholarly career to investigating solidarity practices within and across Black US American communities and Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx spaces. For those of us who know the Deep South intimately, particularly its old South cities, we may be familiar with geographies that often feel very Caribbean. It's the histories of colonialism, racial genocide, and slavery that bind these spaces together. For me, New Orleans was always an extended part of the Caribbean region. For my Puerto Rican family, I was born on the mainland, but also I was born in a city that felt like an island of its own, one with Haitian, Cuban, Dominican, and Puerto Rican ties. So I was born at a crossroads on another kind of borderland, as the Chicana feminist intellectual Gloria Anzaldúa might have called it. It's a geographical space that intersects US colonialism, slavery, and Jim Crowism with Caribbean history and cultural practices. I believe this background is what has fueled my interest in solidarity and my commitment to enacting it in my own politics, scholarship, and everyday life. I should also add that I've always felt rebellious. I'm not sure when it began, but it's another theme that has inspired my work in media and resistance. Perhaps I've always had the spirit of my grandmother's, one who supported Puerto Rico's independence until she died in her home, and another one who defied the island's machista culture by living according to her own rules. I want to think that it's in their spirit I've explored these questions, which I've listed on this slide. Why solidarity? So how, where, when, and why do activists enact solidarity? How might these strategies bridge the lived experiences of people forced to live on the margins of society? How do these practices get communicated and mediated? How might they envision liberation politics and alternative societies free from subjugation and fugitive ways of being? And where When and where do these politics fall apart, and how might the consequences jeopardize long-lasting movements? And finally, how might we learn from past social movements to survive more precarious futures? Of course, today, I'm not going to answer all of these questions, but I list these here to give you some understanding of the kinds of questions my research has attempted to answer. We can I want to start by defining solidarity as the unity or unified action across individuals or groups who have common interests and enact mutual support. Solidarity can refer to affect, a feeling or spirit of unity or action. To be clear, being in solidarity doesn't mean that one's experience is the same as another, nor does it focus attention solely on empathizing with individuals. In fact, it's important to understand the specific historical context that situate different groups of people and the political structures people are resisting. This knowledge is imperative in any feeling or act of solidarity. Solidarity then considers different lived experiences while finding common ground for the purposes of acting against political and social structures. Within media studies, some scholars and professionals have recently highlighted the promises of solidarity journalism, a concept that has recently gained more traction in the professional field of journalism and journalism studies. To study solidarity journalism means that we ask questions about power, critically unravel and dispel objectivity as a journalistic norm. And I should add a very kind of specific US Western journalistic norm, and discover new ways of doing and studying journalism. In an essay published for Neiman Lab, Anita Varma writes that in journalism, solidarity takes the form of including the perspectives of communities who have long been shut out of representations of injustices affecting their own lives. Solidarity journalism reveals that injustice prevents people from simply choosing to improve their conditions. Varma argues that this approach would encourage news organizations to decide on what's newsworthy based on the stakes of human dignity and urgent needs for survival. Here, I want to expand beyond solidarity journalism and kind of think about alternative journalistic practices that support social justice causes, where solidarity journalism is one approach that centers those media-making practices made by and for marginalized voices. In fact, mainstream journalism could learn from other historical forms of media-making practices that have always centered Black and Brown voices and lived experiences. These are media that transcend time, place, and space boundaries. In storytelling across print and digital spaces, activists, particularly activists of color, have engaged in various forms of discursive solidarity practices. So drawing from Michel Foucault's concept of discursive practices, here I refer to the ways activists produce knowledge across different sites. In the archaeology of knowledge, Foucault argues that political practice takes part in the emergence, insertion, and functioning of discourse. Or in cultural studies scholar Stuart Hall's words, I'm referring to the particular ways of representing. How activists have represented and enacted solidarity politics in their writings and organizing. So I'm not only examining discourse, but I'm also attentive to how and why activists take part in producing discourse that builds, supports, and sometimes disrupts solidarity across Brown and Black communities. Understanding how activists have shaped solidarity practices might offer us a path forward for surviving in and across community. It's this communal survival that we desperately need as we seek to address unjust and oppressive systems that link so many of the crises impacting communities of color today, including deportation, the prison industrial complex and militarism, and climate and environmental disaster, just to name a few. So what does this mean in practice? As I've already suggested, we can take a historical perspective to unpack how activists have deployed media and discursive practices in their efforts to raise awareness, build community, and promote solidarity with other marginalized groups. In other words, we can look to history for examples that illustrate how activists have produced meaning in their quest for survival and liberation, and we can ask what that might mean for us in our futures. So I don't want to go too deep into the book. This is a work in progress that I've been working on for a few years. It's related to what I started in grad school, which was for my dissertation, then I took a break. And in the past few years, I've returned to this topic of examining Black writers for whom Cuba played a prominent role in their work. And these are Black writers based in the US who after 1959 really were inspired by what the Cuban Revolution offered. And so this was, of course, Cuba and Cuban Revolution wasn't the only national revolution in the kind of mid 1900s that would inspire, for instance, Black power politics. But because of its geographical proximity, it's kind of I think the geographical importance and its anti-imperialist, anti-US empire work and kind of how fighting against US imperialism was very much at the center of the Cuban Revolution wasn't the only issue that was kind of important for the revolution, but it definitely was a theme that leftist activists in the US were wanted to think more about. The other thing that is really important about the Cuban Revolution, it's also seen as a revolution as it was touted by Cuban revolutionaries like Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and others, and then also within US leftist circles, kind of thinking through the island's history of race and colonialism and slavery, and how the revolution essentially would kind of bring in anti-discrimination policies so that, and anti-literacy programs that really kind of would benefit and impact Black Cubans on the island. And so for a lot of the Black power activists who were working in the US, what the Cuban Revolution essentially signaled was, we can have change, we can have transformative change in a short amount of time. We don't need to wait, to be patient for progress, as sometimes kind of the traditional civil rights movement, you heard that discourse a lot, and also people who critiqued the civil rights movement. And so Black power activists were really inspired by what kind of Fidel Castro's new government offered. Now, of course, I say this with caution because in hindsight and since the revolution, it's, we want to be careful not to, of course, romanticize, but I do think that it's important to understand the idea of Cuba, right? Not just the idea of Cuba in the kind of eyes of the US government, or the idea of like the white imagination of colonial Cuba, but also the imagination of what Cuba offered as a kind of future for anti-racism, essentially, right? And so it became kind of seen as like a model for anti-racist revolution, anti-classist revolution. And of course, again, this is all, I draw largely from Robin D.G. Kelley's work on the idea of like the Black radical imaginary. And so this is what is really inspiring a lot of the work that I'm doing here. And so I'll give you a couple of examples. So I don't want to go, again, too deep into this, but so one of the chapters, for instance, I'm looking at Black Panther Party leaders like Huey P. Newton, Elaine Brown. And so not to give a history that I'm sure many people are already familiar with in terms of Black Panther Party, but for instance, Huey P. Newton was someone who in the mid-1970s had to flee US persecution, so went to Cuba, lived there in exile for 3 years, and then Elaine Brown took over as kind of the chair of the party while he was in Cuba. And so this, in one of the chapters, I kind of explore the relationship that Huey P. Newton had developed with the Cuban government, the support that Black Panther Party had kind of expressed in their newspaper for the Cuban Revolution, how intellectuals and revolutionary figures like Che Guevara were kind of prominent in a lot of their political education programs. And of course, this is kind of a long list of all the different kind of textbooks that they would read, but guerrilla warfare was really kind of took a prominent role in the texts that they studied within the party. And so Cuba really kind of had a really important, again, kind of played a really important imagination about what liberation politics could look like. But also what this book does and what these chapters does is that it unpacks not only the efforts to enact solidarity with Cubans, particularly, I have to be kind of very specific to say that this like bonding was between revolutionaries or radical kind of the radical left activists of Black Power in the US, but also with the Cuban government. And so what I'm looking at is the way they kind of constructed and thought about Cuba as in the kind of lens that Cuban scholars have really have also highlighted is this idea of like fidelismo. And I argue that a lot of that kind of the work that writers and activists were doing were affirming this idea of fidelismo, right? That Cuba was Castro's Cuba, which also was like this kind of machista narrative, right? And so I'm looking at the kind of ways in which those constructions limited the possibilities for long-lasting solidarity between US Black Americans and Cubans. The other characters that are featured in this book are Assata Shakur, who still lives in Cuba today, who had to flee US persecution as well in the 80s, and has lived in exile since. And she's someone who has really spoken out about kind of understanding the faults and flaws of the Cuban Revolution, but also reminding us of the ideals of the revolution. And so I think it's really interesting to be able to, again, see the Cuban Revolution, even in like moving into the 1990s and early 2000s, even as Cuba is still fighting kind of, US embargo politics. And of course, you have the people who are also leaving Cuba and arriving in Florida. And so you have all of these kind of, all of the geopolitics of Cold War and migrations, but within that, how some Black activists and writers still held on to the Cuban Revolution as a promise. Again, with understanding that those promises weren't realized, but that it was at least a moment to think about what could an equitable society look like, even if Cuba hadn't actually fulfilled the actual role in practice. And I could give the long list of how they didn't, but I won't do that. What I think is also important here to make note of is that I'm less concerned in this book about giving some overview of like what Cuba is and isn't, or what it was and wasn't, right? And what the revolution, it's not necessarily doing that. Again, it's more about kind of how these Black writers are constructing and representing Cuba and the revolution, what it meant for US radical politics. So my purpose isn't to romanticize the revolution, but I do write against the colonial eye that wishes to see Cuba under the thumb of the US financial market. And I want to work against Latinx imaginations that privilege whiteness and embrace the Cold War political rhetoric of anti-communism. My goal is to examine how Black writers offered contested visions of revolutionary politics and how it's in these discursive practices that they generated meaning about solidarity and liberation politics. So if we are to draw lessons from 20th century social movements, then we might ask what a relationship between Black activists and Black Cubans on the island would generate. For the past 60 years or so, US Black Americans signal to us that we can at least imagine fugitive possibilities and remember historical formations of solidarity movements, even when they didn't last. But since the 1990s, we have seen some efforts, much of it taking place in artistic spaces like the transnational intersections of hip hop, and that is between US and Cuba, or the cultural exchanges, for instance, between Black jazz musicians in New Orleans and in Cuba. These are a continuation of earlier attempts to bridge Black US American and Cuban experiences to raise awareness about the struggles each community faces. But these exchanges often occur within tourist economies of places like Havana and New Orleans. So I might ask a different question. What might a more sustainable form of solidarity look like outside of capitalist production? So how might we draw lessons from our past to survive the various forms of disaster impacting people's lives today? This isn't just a question for activists and academics, but also educators. In her book, Community as Rebellion, Lorgia Garcia Peña writes that we need more than inclusion and diversity. We need revolution and rebirth. We need to start anew from a place in which the lives and experiences of people who have been silenced and excluded are centered. Garcia Peña reminds us that in community, there is rebellion. As we consider what community might look like today, we might take notice of 20th century activists, their strategies for creating solidarity across communities and sometimes nations, as in the case of Cuba. What would it mean to take lessons from Assata Shakur, who fought alongside and in front of Black men revolutionaries, and who has remained committed to exposing the sexist impulses of revolutionary practices? I'm reminded also of the relationship between Palestinian and St. Louis activists that developed during the Ferguson movement. Within and outside of digital media spaces, Palestinian and Black activists in St. Louis, Missouri, sought to connect their shared experiences of living under occupied territory while making sure to acknowledge their different experiences of repressive systems. To raise awareness about the relationship between police brutality, militarism, and racial capitalism, Black and Palestinian activists took to social media, live streaming, writing blogs online, street art on the streets of St. Louis, and mobilized residents across the county and city in both private and public spaces. As I've already illustrated, building these necessary linkages across marginalized communities isn't always easy or intuitive. So for instance, in the case of activists, US Black activists, and kind of trying to enact solidarity with the Cuban government, much of those actions kind of started falling apart once you get to the late 1980s and early 1990s. Of course, there's a lot of historical context around what was happening at that time, which is largely having to do a lot with a lot of the leftist organizations essentially being crushed by the US government, Cuba going through economic crisis, special period in the 1990s, changes their economy. Their politics also continue to evolve. And so there's, like as scholars and historians have kind of already argued, and I don't think I'm saying anything necessarily new here, is that solidarity isn't easy. It's very hard work, but there's also a roadmap. In his essay, Building a Culture of Solidarity, Racial Discourse, Black Lives Matter, and Indigenous Social Justice, Santos Ramos highlights points of tension that need to be addressed for fostering cross-cultural solidarity. Using the Black Lives Matter movement as a case study, Ramos argues that we need to examine the role of non-Black people of color and the Black Lives Matter movement, interrogate anti-Blackness within Latinx communities, simultaneously acknowledge our similarities and differences, oppressions and privileges, challenge the tendency to universalize the conception of race, which makes it impossible to recognize people who identify across racial and ethnic constructions, complicate racial hierarchies to acknowledge specific struggles within adjacent communities, and employ the indigenous idea of relationality to understand one's position in relation to the world, land, people, and living beings. Ramos argues we need to understand solidarity as putting the work of communities of color into relationship with one another. Where and how can we create solidarity across Brown and Black communities? This is a question I pose as a comrade, an educator, and scholar. What I learned from my research in Ferguson, for instance, was that digital space is not and cannot be our only portal for enacting and studying activism and solidarity. When activists have participated in media making practices, they've done so in physical movement, as in the case in Cuba, for instance, where, of course, we're talking about different forms of media, but a lot of times Black writers were making media while also traveling to Cuba and witnessing the revolution. So whether it was traveling to witness another nation's renewal or dying on local streets and bridges, it was these moments and in specific places that helped create community. While I believe it is imperative to examine the ways Black and Brown online creators are giving voice to the lived experiences of people forced to live on the margins, I think it's just as important to study media making practices in physical communities, in neighborhoods, on streets, with each other. One form that we now see reemerging is the zine, which are profit resistant, that has online presence, but also, according to Ash Watson and Andy Bennett, it's made meaningful through the immersive materiality of the analog zine form. I see contemporary zines as the continuation of the work that 20th century activists engaged in when they created what we know today as the underground press. Similar to the hundreds of printed materials that circulated within leftist organizations and across communities and nations, zines can be described as non-professional, small circulation magazines which creators produce, publish, and distribute by themselves. They're also, and this is according to several different scholars, but they're seen as non-academic third spaces that reveal transformative potentials, re-envision history, serve as critical reversals of the normative gaze, deploy emotion as embodied resistance, and produce coalitional consciousness and practices of articulation that have potential to create and mobilize communities for social justice. So I'm interested in zines as a contemporary alternative space that is not always captured by techno-capitalist production. Kiana Irvin, a dear friend of mine and brilliant feminist scholar, has had her students create zines in her Intro to Women and Gender Studies class. When I asked her why zines, she told me that they quote, offer a uniquely generative approach to creation, community building around shared interests, and the articulation of a collective voice. The deconstructionist form of the zine, the physical processes involved in its production and its anti-establishment aesthetic opens up new possibilities for collaborative learning, dreaming of more just futures and expressing political and social resistance to the status quo. They help learning communities think about the conditions of possibility. And I would argue it was these same possibilities that drew 20th century activists to the medium of printed newsletters, posters, pamphlets, and magazines. And I do want to give credit for this image that I have here to Just Seeds, which is a collection of creative artists and printmakers. So why solidarity? In his short book, Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During the Crisis and the Next, Dean Spade writes that the survival work, when done in conjunction with social movements demanding transformative change, is called mutual aid. As Spade argues, solidarity creates opportunities for building and connecting large-scale movements. I'm not the first to say that when we build community and enact healthy solidarity practices, we can envision and begin to shape non-dystopian futures. We might look at the abolition movement for inspiration. I'm reminded of the presence of perpetual policing in Black and Brown neighborhoods, how living in a racialized community means that you live under the most extreme austerity measures imposed by the state while also facing environmental hazards like policing and surveillance. Policing and surveillance in Black and Brown communities can often lead to imprisonment, sudden deportation, and family separation or death. So we might see the police murders of Tyree Nichols in Memphis and the environmental activists in Atlanta who went by the name of Tortuguita as victims of both police brutality and environmental disaster. While on the surface, the murder of Nichols is different from that of Tortuguita, if we look deeper, we can see how they intersect. What intersects them is the reality that state and private funding of policing is rooted in racial capitalism. In the case of Atlanta, environmental activists have been defending a sacred urban forest from the Atlanta Police Foundation's proposal to build a police training center, what activists are calling Cop City. So I'm not sure if I think I skipped over this, but Tortuguita was an environmental activist who was part of the Defend the Forest movement in Atlanta and was killed by police. And so in the case, so the, where was I, sorry. So police abolitionist and environmental activist, and Tortuguita was someone who was very much kind of, as well as other activists who are still occupying the area and still fighting for, not only fighting for stolen land, but against policing. They're also kind of fighting against environmental disaster. And so these activists, but also media creators, are actively engaged with the intersections of police brutality and environmental destruction. And so there's been a lot of zines that have emerged from various different organizations, but also artists and writers. So this is, there was a zine that's circulated by Anarchist Zines, and it's called The Wilani Cafe Still Lives in Our Hearts zine, which pays homage to the Wilani Cafe, which was a kitchen that existed in the forest in Atlanta, where activists are now defending. And the zine features an edited transcript from an interview conducted with a participant of the cafe who offers a brief history of its development. So the Wilani Cafe was a short-lived project that was physically designed to have people who were cooking or doing dishes to be part of an event happening in the parking lot. Here, the discourse of resistance that emerged among activists protecting the forest from the continuation of racial violence and land destruction was produced in relation to the physical act of building a communal kitchen that simultaneously served as a space of rebellion. I'm also reminded of residents in St. Louis who told me that they first participated in the Ferguson movement through food. They brought their kitchens to the streets and fed people. They distributed water while marching. They worked with kids and created art on the sidewalks. Their decisions to take the streets, to reclaim St. Louis, to seek justice for Michael Brown echo those discursive practices of earlier 20th century activists who searched for liberation in and outside of the United States. Their words, statements, declarations, artistic expressions emerged through their physical movements, which sometimes manifested in them crossing national borders to see revolution for themselves. It's in these actions and discourse where we can see possibilities for communal survival. So let me end by returning to Tortuguita's intention to intersect the abolition movement with environmental justice and remind us that if we are to bring awareness to the various injustices Latinx communities face in the US and outside of the US, then we have to do it while resisting systems of patriarchy and the allure of whiteness. And we have to expand our understandings of the various intersections between Latinidad, indigeneity, and Blackness. As scholars, this means that we increasingly take up space in ways that Chicana feminist Gloria Anzaldúa would have wanted, to generate borderlands where we rebuild rebellious communities and find common interests in fighting against global oppressive systems. Of course, these communities have always existed and will continue to materialize, but how do we save and cultivate these spaces and places? As media studies educators, it might mean that we make radical media with our students through non-professionalized, non-traditional formats, radicalizing how we expect students to engage in media production and creating spaces outside of white patriarchal centered journalistic norms. It means that we take to the analog form of the zine. As one of my students recently asked her classmates in my Women in Media class, what do we do that is right? So thank you for your time. And I've also added here a link to the Defend the Atlanta Forest movement in case you're interested in looking at any more printed material. They have really great, they have lots of different zines, lots of different posters, and are just really beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mislán, for this really wonderful presentation. Just a quick reminder, I want to remind our audience, if you have any question, you can submit it in the Q&A button that is at the bottom of your screen. We can address, we will read it out loud so the Professor Mislán can answer your question. But first I wanna talk about, for me, when you were talking, a lot of concepts mixed together, ethics of care, the power of trust, also how ethics of care and trust translates to social media movements, and everything is like entangled together of how Latinx communities have worked together for histories and have this sensation of this feeling that because we share a common language, we have like similar struggles. So first I want to ask you about, what do you think is the role of language also in these things, and also in the solidarity practice among the Latinx communities? And how do you think that ethics of care, trust, and solidarity mix together also?
Very good questions. So the first question about language, you want to give me a little bit more in terms of what you're thinking?
Yeah, so feminist movement have a history of the Latino feminist movement, that they were like a transnational movement because they have similar backgrounds. And a lot of scholars have acknowledged that because we have a similar language that is Spanish, we can address similar issues in a similar way. So I was thinking about, how do you think that the language helps to this, can help to the not mass production, but how can help to this practice of solidarity, and how they can be more mainstream among the activists?
Yeah. So, thinking about language, for me, the way I think about language is going to be potentially a little bit, especially in terms of, let's say for me, what might be more relevant is, Latinx activism in the US, right? And so, I'm Puerto Rican, but I grew up on the mainland. I grew up in the US. And so I think there's a way in which, for instance, Latinx communities in the US also share particular languages. Like, for instance, I think about, in the like Spanglish as being one that's like really important for my own, like who I am and identity, and how I sometimes kind of move back and forth between the two. But that's going to be very different, I think, also from the context of thinking about language across Latin America, right? When you're talking about communities, not necessarily from a kind of US-centered perspective. And so I'm not familiar with the scholarship about language kind of in Latin America and the ways that potentially offers possibilities for solidarity, but it would make sense, I think. But I also want to say that, like, it seems to me that language is also very specific. And so while it offers potentially solidarity possibilities across borders, especially when you're talking about an entire region that was colonized by the Spanish, which is why people speak Spanish. But also, I think sometimes the focus on Spanish also can exclude, like, for instance, indigenous communities across Latin America, Black communities across Latin America, who potentially might have their own languages as well, right? And so I think I would argue that I can see ways in which that there would be shared experiences, but I could also see ways that there would be like disruptions across solidarity because of that. And so I think it would be I think it would be interesting, right? Like to kind of do more research about this, actually, to see like, where does language act as a disruption to potentially enacting solidarity? And so, there's a good point that a historian, David Werdiger, who essentially talks about solidarity and how like often we want to focus on the ways that they connect us, but we don't study enough how solidarity can also be disrupted by all kinds of different cultural, social, political, historical context. And so I'd be interested, and I actually don't know the answer to this, but I'd be interested to think about, you know, what are the like ways in which like differences in language can also disrupt, and then potentially asking ourselves, how do we though cultivate across those language barriers, right? Like I don't know if they're called, I don't know if we should call them barriers, but differences, I'll say, right? So I don't think I'm answering your question. I'm actually posing more questions. Because I think it's an interesting question that I don't know that I have the like a specific answer now, except just like to want to ask more questions about what are the ways that language is also different across borders, across communities, even within borders, and then potentially what are some examples or communities where people are working through those differences. I would be interested in that, and I don't really know the answer to that, right? I think, and I'm sure that this is also something that scholars are writing about within kind of like Latinx communities within the US. Because I think about myself where, you know, I have a Caribbean background. And while I have potentially some shared experience with other Latinx communities, like Mexican American communities, there's a lot of differences too, right? There's like difference in language and cultural practice and kind of everyday life, right? So what does it look like to, for me to enact solidarity and my politics, you know, around issues that impact, you know, Mexican American communities, right? Like there's still kind of, I think really, it's really important for us to think about what those shared experiences are, but also to simultaneously be able to unpack potentially what the differences are as well. I know. And then the second question, you're going to have to remind me what the second question was, because I was talking too much for this first one.
Thank you. No, you make really excellent point. First, can I ask you to stop sharing your screen, please?
I was going to ask if I should do that.
But we have two questions from the audience, so I want to privilege that. So Litsi Galarza says, thank you so much for this presentation, Dr. Mislán. Can you talk about where you see these media making practices of coalition across Black and Brown communities as cultural citizenship? Or my scholarship or on citizenship intersect with your phenomenal work on journalism?
Yeah, so, okay. The question is, hi, Litsi, by the way. The question is around how Black and Brown solidarity and media making is related to citizenship. Is that the question?
Cultural citizenship.
Cultural citizenship. You know, so this is an interesting question that could be answered in so many ways. And this is something, maybe perhaps I can use my second book project as a way to talk about this a little bit. So in my second book project, I'm looking at climate justice, climate and environmental justice in Louisiana, Southern Louisiana, and Black and Brown communities, and then also in Puerto Rico. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, and people have written about kind of isolated ways where there's a lot of research on Hurricane Katrina that happened in Louisiana in 2005 that many people are probably familiar with because it had such a devastating effect in not only in the area of like the Gulf Coast, but also the displacement that happened in New Orleans after Katrina. That was very similar, for instance, with the displacement and the devastations that happened in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. Different, but also there's a way in which we can think about shared experiences among Black and Brown communities across those geographical spaces. And one of them is actually, I've been thinking about citizenship, right? And so one of the kind of, speaking of discourse, after Hurricane Katrina, a lot of the kind of public discourse essentially positioned or framed Black residents from New Orleans as kind of second-class citizens, right? Citizens, sorry. Now, of course, the fight for citizenship rights has always been kind of prevalent in US history, from, emancipation and moving into like Reconstruction era and civil rights movement. I mean, that the fight for full citizen rights has always been part of like Black struggles, Black freedom struggles. And so, we still kind of see that need, because again, a lot of kind of the discourse around Black people in the US, but also, in this particular case in New Orleans, was like kind of framing people as like, as if they were not US citizens. And we know that in case of Puerto Ricans, legally Puerto Ricans are like second-class citizens, right? And so I think there's some interesting ways where we can start thinking about, and I know that gets into kind of like legal discourse, but I think this is also part of like kind of the idea of like cultural citizenship, is that how we might think about the shared experiences across Black and Brown people around thinking about like, how do we define the US, who is part of the US, who isn't part of the US? And these are situations where people absolutely have been excluded in terms of being defined as part of the US, right? As if of stripping away any kind of ideas of citizenship. And so I think that's one of the kind of experiences that brings, this idea of like finding common interests and finding where the experiences overlap. While again, different, but at the same time, there's ways that we can start to like question who we include and exclude from the idea of the nation is absolutely crossing Black and Brown communities. I don't know if that was Litsy's what she was intending for me to talk about, but that's how it allowed me to talk a little bit about my next book. So I appreciate that. I'm not sure if she has a follow-up question, because I'm not sure if she was looking for anything else or something more specific.
We can wait to see if she has a follow-up question. So next, Facundo has another question.
Thank you very much, Professor Mislán, for this very, very fascinating and enlightening talk. My question sort of like builds upon, let's see, like my understanding of let's see question and this idea of citizenship. And I was thinking whether this solidarity practice and the material devices like the media, like the science, for instance, can help not only promote or foster cross-cultural solidarity, but also transcend the media practice itself and look for like social transformation. And when I'm thinking in social transformation, I'm thinking in involving in some way the state. Is it feasible to build solidarity not only like horizontally, but also like vertically? That's my question.
So I want to make sure I understand the question. So when you said and vertically, you're essentially, because you also said something about the state, like if it's state supported, or
yeah, if we can think of these practices and like social bonds, not only among like people that have been marginalized or like they share like this common ground, but also if these people can also share like in having this idea of mind of like long-lasting transformation. If we can think about solidarity, but also including like people that have power as a way of promoting actual change, right?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And so I immediately think of arguments that potentially would push back against the desire for some people to want to include institutions in these practices, right? And I think, and that probably would bring us into a long philosophical conversation about, when activists do develop relationships with institutions, that potentially, I think history has shown us, often whitewashes and takes away from, the kind of radical ideas and imaginations that potentially people were working toward. And so I think, there's a lot of examples of this, and there's been a lot of kind of debate about like, to what extent should activists be developing these relationships with institutions, or, and how that takes away often from like, again, the kind of like what could have started off as like these like really kind of radical imaginaries and radical ideas for the future, that they become co-opted essentially, and they become part of, the like, whether it's like the techno-capitalist, or capitalist production, or get co-opted into states so that they're no longer radical. Something that I've been thinking about with the Cuba book is that, part of my critique is that not only was the kind of discourse of Cuba this, reinforcing or affirming this kind of masculinist idea of the Cuban Revolution, but also that the solidarity was more with a state versus with people, right? And so potentially that was one of the reasons why maybe solidarity was not long lasting. And so I think, I'm not sure, and this is something that I've been thinking about and kind of working through and trying to figure out, like, what does that mean for activism today in terms of, and there is the argument that like, if there isn't some sort of connection made with the state, that potentially things won't change, right? That we'll just always be outside of the system. But at the same time, I do think that, like, I personally do think that we need these kind of radical spaces that push against the system without us trying to become part of the system, right? This is the kind of also arguments around, like, do you reform police or do you abolish the system? And I always tend to want to say, no, we abolish the system, because the system is like at its foundation a violent one. I can't imagine that kind of developing relationships with these kind of very violent systems is going to do anything really, or have any kind of transformative changes. But I guess someone could also argue that if you're always working outside of it, you might not have transformative changes as well, as which I think is what you're asking, yes?
Yeah. My question was along these lines. So yeah, thank you for reflecting on that.
So we have a last question from the audience. It's from Maciel Couch Maldonado. She said that your research has many similarities with her research around activism of women of color in social media in Mexico, US, and Canada. And she has a really broad question about where do you get your idea for this research, and if you have published something related to what you present.
Yeah, so the book is a work in progress. I've been working on it for a few years, and hopefully we'll get it out into the world some point soon. I've definitely have published kind of, individual articles about Black press, for instance, the Black press and kind of underground press of 20th century. I did some work a few years ago on the Ferguson movement that looked at activist uses of social media and live streaming as ways to like counteract traditional journalistic representations of the movement. And so the Ferguson movement, just for anyone who, by now, I imagine a lot of people know about the murder of Michael Brown in St. Louis, Missouri. But the Ferguson movement was kind of started by local, longtime St. Louis activists not just in reaction to the murder of Michael Brown, because these were activists who were working on the issues of police brutality, and also like St. Louis, very specific kind of racial and economic histories. And so in that research, we interviewed activists, and we really really got some really rich kind of understanding of how activists are challenging like media making practices while also using them to essentially counteract the kind of very violent and representations that we often get about protests and activism and activists, especially in the aftermath of police violence. So there's absolutely, I mean, I would just say that like everything that I've ever published has probably related in some way, form, or shape to the questions that I raised today. That was the question, right? To talk about, okay.
And we have a follow-up from Litsi Galatza. She says that the work of Renato Rosaldo, cultural anthropologist on cultural citizenship, refers to practices that convey a sense of human worth, including dignity, respect, and trust, intersect quite nicely with the way you describe solidarity practices. So citizenship happens in relations on citizens to the state and in relation among communities. So excited for your books.
Thank you,
in plural.
Lindsay. I'm gonna note the author, if you can send me a message so I can remember to look it up, because I will not remember that.
Thank you, Litsi. Hello, I'm great to have you in the audience. Thank you, Cristina, for a phenomenal seminar. Thank you, Catalina, for great moderation and questions. Thanks to everybody in the audience for staying with us through the end after our time. I wish you all great rest of your days, and see you again next week for the next installment of this virtual seminar series. Once again, Cristina, thanks a lot. This was fabulous.
Thank you, Pablo.
Bye now.